The crowd gasped as 11-year-old Zora approached the snarling German shepherd. Blood dripped from where 3 professional trainers had already failed. Billionaire Richard Blackwood smirked, certain his money was safe. Nobody expected what happened when the homeless black girl whispered 4 simple words to the beast. Before we continue this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're ready to see how one brave girl changed a billionaire's heart forever with just her courage and compassion. Richard Blackwood stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Seattle mansion, the city lights twinkling far below like distant stars. At 63, the tech billionaire had everything money could buy. Yet the enormous house echoed with emptiness since Eleanor's death 3 years ago. The only sound breaking the silence was the clicking of Atlas's nails on the marble floor as the massive German shepherd padded to his side. Richard absently stroked the dog's head, the animal leaning into his touch with a low rumble of contentment. Atlas was his last connection to Eleanor, the dog she'd rescued from an abusive situation shortly before her diagnosis. After Eleanor died, Atlas had changed, becoming aggressive toward everyone except Richard, as though the trauma of losing her had broken something inside him too. Richard understood that feeling all too well. His phone buzzed on the table, another message from his executive assistant reminding him about the board meeting tomorrow. He'd missed the last 3, citing various excuses, but they were growing impatient with his reclusiveness. The board wanted him visible, the face of Blackwood Technologies, shaking hands and attending galas. They didn't understand that the thought of small talk and fake smiles made his skin crawl. Besides, he couldn't leave Atlas alone. The dog's separation anxiety manifested in destroyed furniture and howling that prompted complaints from neighbors, even on his sprawling estate. And bringing Atlas anywhere was out of the question. The last dog trainer had left yesterday with 3 puncture wounds in his arm, cursing Richard and his demon dog as security escorted him out. The trainer had been the 5th professional to fail each one, arriving with certificates and guarantees, each leaving with wounded pride and sometimes worse. Richard's security chief had warned him about liability, suggesting that Atlas might need to be put down if his aggression couldn't be controlled. The thought made Richard's chest tighten with panic. He wouldn't lose the last living thing that connected him to Eleanor. Anger flared as he remembered the trainer's parting words. "That dog is beyond help, Mr. Blackwood. Even your billions can't fix him." Something had snapped in Richard then, a perfect storm of grief, isolation, and defiance. He'd grabbed his phone and posted something impulsive to his rarely used social media account. $1 million to anyone who can calm my dog Atlas within 30 minutes. No harm to the dog. Professionals welcome to try. Serious inquiries only. He'd added his business email, then shut his phone off and gone to bed. By morning, his post had gone viral. His assistant called in a panic as media outlets picked up the story. Animal behaviorists debated the ethics of the challenge. His PR team scrambled to either capitalize on or contain the sudden attention. Richard had been about to delete the post and dismiss it as a momentary lapse in judgment when the first email arrived. A celebrity dog trainer with his own TV show wanted to accept the challenge. Then another email came, and another. By noon, his assistant had organized the emails into a spreadsheet with over 200 applicants. Something stirred in Richard that he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. He found himself instructing his staff to set up a proper venue for the challenge on the grounds of his estate. His security team cordoned off an area of the lawn, setting up barriers to protect observers from Atlas while allowing clear visibility. Local news vans parked outside his gates. Social media exploded with opinions about the billionaire's challenge, some calling it an extravagant display of wealth, others intrigued by the opportunity it presented. Richard told himself he was just following through on his word, but secretly he hoped no one would succeed. Atlas was his excuse, his reason for remaining isolated in his grief, and he couldn't imagine anyone could succeed where so many professionals had failed. The first day of the challenge dawned clear and cool. Richard sat in a chair at one end of the enclosure, Atlas lying at his feet, seemingly calm but alert. The first challenger was a woman in her 40s with 20 years of experience rehabilitating aggressive dogs. She entered confidently, speaking in soothing tones. Atlas was on his feet instantly. Hackles raised a growl, rumbling from deep in his chest. The woman tried various techniques, but within 10 minutes she was backing toward the exit, Atlas advancing menacingly. The second trainer, a man who worked with police K-9 units, lasted 15 minutes before Atlas lunged, tearing his expensive jacket. The third, a young behaviorist with a new, supposedly revolutionary approach, ended up requiring medical attention when Atlas caught his hand. As the medical team bandaged the trainer, Richard noticed the crowd that had gathered. Mostly local media and curious neighbors, but also ordinary people drawn by the spectacle. He caught snatches of their conversations, throwing money around to watch people get hurt, and classic rich guy entertainment. Richard felt a flicker of shame quickly suppressed. He hadn't forced anyone to participate. They all wanted his money, and if they failed, that was on them. He called the first day to a close. Atlas still undefeated and returned to his empty house, unsure if he felt relieved or disappointed. In a small clearing within the wooded area, bordering Richard Blackwood's estate, 11-year-old Zora Johnson carefully adjusted the tarp that served as the roof of their makeshift home. The early autumn rains had started, and she needed to ensure their few belongings stayed dry. The homeless encampment was hidden from the main road, a collection of tents and improvised shelters, housing about 20 people who had fallen through the cracks of Seattle's booming economy. Zora had been living here with her mother Diana for 8 months now, ever since they'd been evicted from their apartment. Diana had worked as an administrative assistant until she developed rheumatoid arthritis that left her unable to type for long periods. Without health insurance, the medical bills piled up, and soon they couldn't make rent. Now Diana worked whatever part-time jobs her condition allowed, cleaning houses or taking customer service calls from her prepaid phone when they could afford to keep it charged. Zora folded the thin blanket that served as their bed, tucking it into a plastic bin to keep it dry. School would start in an hour, and she needed to be ready. Maintaining the appearance of normalcy was essential both to avoid attracting the attention of social services and to preserve her own dignity. She changed into her cleanest outfit, carefully stored in another plastic bin, and ran a brush through her hair. From a nearby tent, an old pit bull mix named Rusty watched her with soulful eyes. Zora knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "Morning, Rusty. Keeping an eye on things." The dog leaned into her touch, and Zora smiled. Animals had always responded to her, seeming to sense her gentle nature. In the encampment, she'd befriended not just Rusty, but several strays that came and went, sharing scraps of food when she could. She had a way with them, especially the skittish ones that shied away from others. Rusty had been the most challenging abandoned, after being used in fights, his body scarred, and his trust shattered. It had taken Zora weeks of patient sitting nearby, never pushing, never demanding before he'd allowed her to touch him. Now he was the unofficial guardian of their little community. Zora's mother stirred in their shelter, her face lined with exhaustion, even in sleep. Zora quietly placed a granola bar beside her, saved from yesterday's free lunch at school. Diana needed the energy more than she did. With her backpack secured, Zora began her walk to school, taking the long route to avoid being seen emerging from the woods by other students. The teasing was bad enough without adding fuel to the fire. At Hamilton Middle School, Zora kept to herself, focusing on her studies despite the challenges. The library had become her sanctuary, not just for the warmth and quiet, but for the books she devoured on animal behavior. Something about understanding how animals communicated fascinated her, perhaps because it was often simpler and more honest than human interaction. During lunch, while hiding in a bathroom stall to avoid the cafeteria and its social hierarchy, Zora overheard 2 girls talking about the crazy billionaire and his killer dog. Curious, she listened as they discussed a wealthy man offering $1 million to anyone who could calm his aggressive German shepherd. Later in the library, Zora found a discarded newspaper with the story on the front page. She read about Richard Blackwood's challenge, studying the photo of the snarling German shepherd. The article mentioned 3 professional trainers had already failed, one requiring stitches. Something about the dog's posture in the photo caught Zora's attention. Behind the aggression, she recognized fear, the same look she'd seen in Rusty's eyes when they first met. That evening, after helping her mother back to their shelter, Zora walked to the edge of the woods where Blackwood's estate was visible in the distance. She could see the setup for the dog, challenge the news vans, the people coming and going, $1 million. The sum was almost incomprehensible. With that money, her mother could get proper medical treatment. They could have a real home again. They could stop hiding. The next day after school, Zora returned to watch from the tree line as more trainers attempted the challenge. Each approached the dog with confidence that quickly turned to fear. None seemed to see what was obvious to Zora. The dog was terrified its aggression, a defense mechanism. She watched carefully studying the German Shepherd's behavior, noting how it responded to different approaches. The third day, Zora worked up the courage to move closer, finding a spot along the fence where she could observe without being noticed. A security guard patrolled nearby, a tall black man with kind eyes despite his stern expression. When he spotted her, Zora expected to be chased away, but he just nodded before continuing his rounds. Emboldened, Zora returned the next day and the day after. On the fifth day, the security guard approached her. "You've been watching a while now," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "You interested in dogs?" Zora nodded, her usual caution around adults momentarily forgotten in her enthusiasm. "That German Shepherd, he's scared, not mean. Nobody's seeing it." The guard, whose name badge read Marcus, raised an eyebrow. "Scared, that dog has sent people to the hospital. Because they're approaching him wrong," Zora explained. "They're trying to show dominance, but he's already dominated by fear. He needs someone to make him feel safe." Marcus studied her thoughtfully. "You sound like you know what you're talking about." "You train dogs." Zora shook her head. "I just understand them. I helped a fighting dog in our—" She caught herself before mentioning the encampment in our neighborhood. Marcus seemed to consider this, then shook his head. "Well, take my advice, kid. Stay on this side of the fence. That challenge isn't for people like us." Something in his tone made it clear he wasn't just talking about her age. "What do you mean?" Zora asked, though she already knew. Marcus glanced toward the mansion. "Mr. Blackwood and his friends, they live in a different world. People like you and me, we're just the help, the entertainment. Know your place, it's safer that way." He walked away before Zora could respond, leaving her staring through the fence with new determination. That night, as her mother slept, Zora sat with Rusty under the stars, her mind racing with possibilities. The guard's warning had only strengthened her resolve. Maybe the challenge wasn't meant for people like her, but that didn't mean she couldn't succeed where others had failed. "What do you think, Rusty?" she whispered, scratching the old dog's ears. "Should I try?" Rusty leaned against her side, his warmth a comfort in the cool night air. Zora had spent her whole life being invisible, being told what she couldn't do because of who she was or where she came from. But with animals, none of that mattered. They saw her true self, not her circumstances. Determined, Zora began to plan. The challenge represented more than money. Now it was a chance to be seen, truly seen for her abilities, rather than dismissed for her appearance or background. The next morning she woke early, put on her cleanest clothes, and told her mother she was going to the library. Instead, she headed toward Blackwood's estate, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and determination. The second day of Richard Blackwood's $1 million challenge brought an even larger crowd than before. Word had spread throughout Seattle and beyond, drawing spectators eager to witness the spectacle of professionals being humbled by a dog. Richard, buoyed by the attention and increasingly confident that his money was secure, had raised the stakes. $2 million, he announced to the assembled media, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. $2 million to anyone who can calm Atlas within 30 minutes without harm to themselves or the dog. Cameras flashed as Richard posed, with a smirking confidence, Atlas sitting regally beside him, deceptively calm in his owner's presence. Today's challengers included a famous animal psychologist who had written best-selling books on canine behavior, a former military dog handler who trained Special Forces animals, and a spiritual animal communicator who claimed to speak telepathically with troubled pets. The psychologist entered the enclosure first armed with scientific theories and a carefully planned approach based on operant conditioning. Atlas saw through the facade, immediately sensing the man's underlying nervousness despite his credentials. Within minutes, the psychologist was retreating his techniques, abandoned in the face of Atlas's aggressive advances. The military trainer lasted longer, his commanding presence, initially causing Atlas to hesitate. But when he attempted to establish dominance through direct eye contact and body positioning, Atlas exploded into a frenzy of barking and lunging that had security rushing to ensure the barriers held. The spiritual communicator barely made it through the gate before turning around claiming the dog's aura was too disturbed for communication today. The crowd alternately laughed and gasped, their entertainment coming at the expense of the increasingly frustrated challengers. Richard observed it all with a satisfied detachment, playing the role of the amused host, while inwardly relieved that his companion remained unimpressed by the parade of experts. As the last scheduled challenger exited the enclosure in defeat, Richard began his customary end-of-day address to the media, thanking them for coming and inviting them to return tomorrow for more attempts. It was then that a commotion at the back of the crowd caught everyone's attention. Security guards were blocking someone, voices raised in argument. The cameras swiveled away from Richard, causing him to frown in annoyance at the disruption. Through the shifting bodies, he glimpsed a small figure trying to push past the guards. "What's going on back there?" he called out, irritated at losing control of his carefully orchestrated event. The crowd parted, and Richard found himself staring at a young black girl, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, thin-framed, and wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days. Her hair was neatly braided, but her sneakers were worn at the edges, the laces frayed. She stood with surprising dignity despite the security guards flanking her. "I want to try," the girl stated, her voice clear and steady despite the hundreds of eyes now fixed on her. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, starting with those closest to Richard. His assistant Patricia, a middle-aged white woman with a perpetual pinched expression, leaned in to whisper loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Security should really do a better job screening. These people always looking for handouts. More laughter followed, crueler this time. Richard studied the girl, momentarily taken aback by her audacity. "You want to try," he repeated, making no attempt to hide his skepticism. "You think you can succeed where professionals with decades of experience have failed?" The girl nodded simply. "Yes, sir. I understand dogs." This prompted more laughter from the crowd, particularly from the wealthy neighbors and business associates Richard had invited to witness the challenge. "Does she understand the concept of liability?" Patricia muttered, rolling her eyes. Richard found himself smiling, not from amusement, but from disbelief at the girl's confidence. "What's your name?" he asked, deliberately drawling the question as though speaking to a much younger child. "Zora Johnson, sir," she replied, unfazed by his condescension. Richard looked around at the entertained crowd, then at the media with their cameras trained on this unexpected development. A PR opportunity presented itself, the benevolent billionaire humoring a child's fantasy. It would make for good optics, and there was zero risk of her succeeding. "Well, Zora," he said, stumbling slightly over her name, as though it were foreign to his tongue, "I'm afraid there are liability issues with allowing a minor to participate. Atlas is dangerous, as you've seen." "I've helped dangerous dogs before," Zora countered, her composure remarkable for someone her age. "And I don't care about liability. I just want a chance." Richard noticed Marcus, one of his security guards, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. The guard seemed to recognize the girl, though he remained silent. A woman in the crowd called out, "Let her try. It'll be the most interesting thing that's happened all day." Others joined in, some genuinely curious, others simply looking for new entertainment after the predictable failures they'd already witnessed. Richard considered the optics again. Refusing the girl would seem harsh, especially with cameras rolling. Allowing her attempt would provide a brief diversion before the day concluded, perhaps even generate more media interest for tomorrow. Besides, Atlas was secured by both a collar and the enclosure. The risk was minimal. "Very well," Richard decided, gesturing to his assistant. "Have her parents sign the waiver, and she can have her 5 minutes of fame." "I don't have parents here," Zora said. "Just me." Something flickered in Richard's expression. Annoyance, perhaps, or confusion at how a child had arrived unaccompanied. Before he could respond, Patricia interjected, "We can't allow it without parental consent. It's a legal nightmare waiting to happen." The crowd's mood shifted, some now calling for the girl to be given a chance, others voicing concerns about allowing a child near the dangerous animal. Richard, always sensitive to public perception, felt trapped between appearing callous by refusing or irresponsible by allowing it. It was Marcus who broke the impasse, stepping forward to whisper something to Patricia. After a brief, intense exchange, Patricia turned to Richard with evident reluctance. "Marcus has offered to take responsibility for her attempt, sir. As a security professional, his consent might provide some legal cover." Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised by his employee's unexpected advocacy. Marcus met his gaze steadily, something unspoken passing between them. Was it challenge, defiance? Richard couldn't quite read it, but he found himself nodding. "Fine. 5 minutes, no more. And if Atlas so much as growls too loudly, we pull her out immediately." As Zora was led toward the enclosure entrance, Richard addressed the crowd again, his tone making it clear he viewed this as nothing more than an amusing interlude. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unexpected volunteer. Young," he paused, having already forgotten her name. "Zora," Marcus supplied quietly. "Young Zora here believes she can succeed where experts have failed. Let's give her a round of applause for her courage, if not her judgment." The audience applauded, some with genuine encouragement, others with the patronizing air of adults humoring a child's naive ambition. Atlas, who had been lying calmly beside Richard throughout the exchange, now rose to his feet, ears forward, as he watched the new challenger approach. Richard released the dog's leash, giving him free movement within the enclosure while maintaining his own position at the far end. As Zora stepped through the gate, a hush fell over the crowd. Would the girl actually make it past the entrance, or would she freeze in fear like so many before her? What happened next stunned everyone present. Atlas, who had merely growled at previous challengers before escalating to lunges and barks, immediately erupted into a frenzy at the sight of Zora. His bark was deeper, more threatening than any had heard before, his powerful body rigid with tension as he advanced toward the girl. "Did you see how Atlas reacted to Zora the moment she entered the enclosure?" Comment number 1. "If you think Richard should have stopped the challenge right then to protect her from harm." Comment number 2. "If you believe Zora showed incredible bravery by not running away at that moment." Has there ever been a time in your life when you stood your ground despite overwhelming fear? Like this video, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, race, or circumstances, and subscribe to see more stories about Time Ever 6 by Time and Tane Hum, Incredible Courage in the Face of Prejudice. What do you think will happen next? Will Zora run away like the others? Or does this young homeless girl possess something special that all the professionals lacked? The crowd collectively held their breath as Atlas advanced toward Zora, his teeth bared in a snarl that chilled even the most composed spectators. Security guards tensed, ready to intervene at Richard's command, but the billionaire himself seemed frozen, watching with a mixture of alarm and morbid curiosity. What happened next defied everyone's expectations. Instead of retreating or showing fear, Zora simply sat down, cross-legged on the grass, her movements slow and deliberate. She kept her eyes downcast, not challenging the dog with direct eye contact as the professionals had done. Atlas stopped his advance, momentarily confused by this unexpected response. He growled again, deeper this time, circling the seated girl with hackles raised. The crowd murmured anxiously, many convinced they were about to witness a tragedy. Patricia clutched Richard's arm, hissing, "Stop this immediately, before we have a lawsuit on our hands." But Richard shook her off, transfixed by the unfolding scene. Something about the girl's demeanor struck him as utterly unique among all the challengers. Where the experts had projected confidence masking underlying fear, Zora exuded genuine calmness. As Atlas continued, his threatening circle around her, Zora began to speak, her voice so soft that only the dog could hear her words. The microphone set up to capture the challenge for media purposes couldn't pick up what she was saying, but her lips moved steadily, her expression serene despite the danger mere feet away. Richard found himself stepping closer, straining to hear an unwelcome curiosity building within him. What could this child possibly be saying to his dog? Atlas completed a full circle around Zora, then another, never taking his amber eyes off her. His growling continued, but had subtly changed in pitch, carrying more confusion than aggression now. 5 minutes passed, then 10, with Zora remaining perfectly still, except for her lips forming quiet words, and Atlas continuing his cautious orbit around her. The audience, initially restless, now watched in hushed anticipation. Even the cameramen had stopped their usual movements, as if afraid to disrupt whatever delicate process was unfolding. 15 minutes into the challenge, Atlas's circles had grown tighter, bringing him closer to Zora with each pass. His growling had diminished to occasional rumbles, his ears no longer pinned back, but shifting between alert and relaxed positions. Richard found himself gripping the barrier with white knuckles, a strange anxiety building in his chest. It wasn't concern for the girl's safety that troubled him now, but something more personal, more threatening to his carefully constructed isolation. For 3 years, Atlas had connected with no one but him. The dog's aggression toward others had been a shield Richard had hidden behind an excuse to remain separate apart. Now he watched as that barrier showed signs of crumbling before a child who had appeared from nowhere. 20 minutes into the challenge, Atlas stopped circling. He stood directly in front of Zora, his massive head lowered to her level ears, twitching as she continued her whispered monologue. The transformation in his posture was remarkable. The tension in his powerful frame had eased, replaced by an alertness that lacked aggression. Richard heard Patricia mutter, "She must have treats hidden in her pockets. This is some kind of trick." But Richard knew better. He had watched carefully, and Zora had brought nothing with her into the enclosure. Besides, Atlas had never been food-motivated enough to override his fear responses. Whatever connection was forming between girl and dog went deeper than bribery. 25 minutes into the challenge, Zora slowly, almost imperceptibly raised her hand palm up and extended it halfway toward Atlas. The dog flinched slightly but didn't retreat or growl. Instead, he stretched his neck forward cautiously, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. The entire crowd seemed to inhale collectively, no one daring to make a sound as the German Shepherd's nose hovered inches from the girl's open palm. In that suspended moment, Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest, as though something inside him was being torn away. Atlas, his last link to Eleanor, his sole companion in grief, was choosing to trust someone else. It felt like betrayal, like loss anew. Then Atlas did the unthinkable. He stepped forward and pressed his muzzle into Zora's palm. A collective gasp rose from the audience as the dog allowed the contact, his tail giving a single hesitant wag. Richard staggered backward slightly, the sight physically affecting him in ways he couldn't articulate. Patricia grabbed his arm, steadying him while whispering urgently, "We need to stop this now before that girl actually succeeds. Think of the money, Richard." Her words penetrated Richard's shocked haze, reminding him of the stakes. $2 million was nothing to him financially, but what it represented, the breach of his isolation, the challenge to his narrative that Atlas could trust no one else, that was incalculable. Before Richard could respond, Atlas took another step toward Zora and lowered himself to the ground beside her, his body making contact with her knee. Zora, still moving with deliberate slowness, began to stroke the dog's neck with gentle fingers. Atlas's eyes half closed in response, a visible shudder running through his powerful frame as tension continued to leave his body. 28 minutes into the challenge, Atlas did something he had never done with anyone except Richard and Eleanor. He placed his head in Zora's lap, a gesture of complete trust and surrender. The silence that had gripped the audience broke in that moment, replaced by murmurs of amazement that quickly swelled to applause. Camera shutters clicked frantically, capturing the incredible moment when the fearsome dog became a picture of contentment under the touch of a homeless child. Richard stood motionless, a storm of conflicting emotions rendering him temporarily speechless. Part of him, a part he wasn't proud of, wanted to call out that the time wasn't officially up to find some technicality to disqualify this unexpected outcome. But the evidence was undeniable. Atlas, who had sent trained professionals to the hospital, was now lying peacefully with his head in Zora's lap, receiving her gentle strokes with visible pleasure. As the 30-minute mark approached, Marcus stepped forward, checking his watch with a significant glance toward Richard. The unspoken question hung in the air: would Richard honor his commitment? The media representatives pressed closer to the barrier's cameras trained on Richard's face, ready to capture his reaction to this unexpected turn of events. Patricia leaned in once more, her voice urgent. "Richard, there must be some clause in the agreement we can invoke. She's a minor, she can't legally claim the prize without guardian consent. We could tie this up in paperwork for months." Richard found his voice at last, though it came out rougher than he intended. "That's enough, Patricia." He stepped forward to the edge of the enclosure, his movement causing Atlas to lift his head alertly from Zora's lap. But instead of returning to Richard's side as expected, the dog merely glanced at his owner before settling back against Zora, clearly communicating his choice to remain with her. Something about that small rejection struck Richard deeply. He had offered money, security, luxury, everything within his considerable power, yet Atlas had chosen the simple authenticity of this child over all of it. In that moment, a memory surfaced: Eleanor, kneeling beside the newly rescued Atlas, speaking to him in that same gentle, patient way Zora had done. "Dogs know," Eleanor had told him. "They see past all our pretenses to who we really are." The 30-minute mark arrived. Marcus announced it officially, his voice carrying across the now buzzing crowd. All eyes turned to Richard, waiting for him to acknowledge what they had all witnessed, the unquestionable success of the most unlikely challenger. Richard cleared his throat, aware of the cameras, the witnesses, the social media that would carry this moment far beyond those physically present. Atlas, his supposedly untamable dog, was now sitting calmly beside a child from the streets, the transformation so complete it seemed almost magical. The implications were uncomfortable. If Atlas could connect with this girl, what did that say about Richard's own isolation? Had it been necessary or merely chosen? Had he been hiding behind the dog's aggression, using it as an excuse to withdraw from a world that continued without Eleanor? Zora looked up at him now, her young face showing neither triumph nor demand, but a simple openness that reminded him painfully of his late wife. The crowd waited the silence, stretching taut with anticipation. Whatever Richard said next would define not just this moment, but how the world would see him in its aftermath. And somewhere deeper in a place he had kept locked since Eleanor's death, he knew it would define something more important: how he would see himself. The cameras flashed incessantly. As Richard Blackwood approached the enclosure where Zora sat with Atlas, the German shepherd, still calm under her touch. The crowd had fallen expectantly silent, waiting for the billionaire to acknowledge what everyone had witnessed: the unqualified success of this unlikely challenger. Richard's face was a carefully composed mask as he opened the gate and entered, his eyes fixed on Atlas rather than the girl. The dog's ears perked up at his owner's approach, but remarkably he remained seated beside Zora, showing none of the exclusive attachment he had demonstrated for years. This small betrayal stung Richard more deeply than he cared to admit even to himself. He stopped several feet away, hands clasped behind his back in a posture of authority. "Interesting performance," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "You've obviously had some training with animals." Zora shook her head. "No training, sir. I just listened to what he was trying to say." Something in her simple response irritated Richard, perhaps because it echoed sentiments Eleanor had often expressed about understanding animals. He turned abruptly toward the assembled media. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've certainly seen something unusual today." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, many nodding enthusiastically, cameras still capturing every moment. However, Richard continued, raising his voice slightly to quiet the murmurs. "I think we need to be clear about what actually happened here." Patricia stepped forward, a tablet in hand, her expression one of professional regret that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Blackwood is correct. While the demonstration was impressive, the official rules of the challenge were quite specific." She held up the tablet, though no one from the audience could possibly read its contents. Participation was limited to individuals over 18 years of age with verifiable credentials in animal behavior or training. Additionally, all participants were required to submit liability waivers signed by themselves or, in special circumstances, by a legal guardian with power of attorney. The crowd's mood shifted, confusion and disbelief, replacing the previous excitement. Zora's hand stilled on Atlas's fur, her eyes widening slightly as she began to understand what was happening. Richard cleared his throat. In light of these pre-established conditions which are necessary for legal and insurance purposes, I'm afraid this demonstration, while entertaining, does not qualify for the monetary award. The silence that followed was deafening, broken finally by a journalist who called out, "Those conditions weren't mentioned in your social media challenge or any of your press releases, Mr. Blackwood." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They were implicit in the serious nature of the challenge. We couldn't possibly allow just anyone off the street to participate without proper vetting. As he spoke, a commotion at the back of the crowd drew attention. A woman was pushing her way forward, her face tight with worry. "Zora, Zora," she called her, voice cracking with panic. The girl's head snapped up, shock registering on her features. Mom Diana Johnson broke through to the front, her eyes taking in the scene, her daughter sitting in an enclosure with a massive dog surrounded by cameras and wealthy spectators. Her work uniform, a cleaner's smock from one of the downtown office buildings, was rumpled and stained, her face flushed from what had clearly been a panicked search. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, fear and anger mingling in her voice. "Mrs. Green from the camp called me at work, said someone saw you on the local news." Zora's composure faltered for the first time. "Mom, I can explain. Get away from that animal right now." Diana's fear was palpable, her hands gripping the barrier so tightly her knuckles whitened. Richard, momentarily forgotten by the crowd, studied the woman with clinical detachment. Her clothes, her evident exhaustion, the reference to the camp, it painted a clear picture that aligned with his initial assessment of Zora. These people were indeed from the streets, probably one of the homeless encampments that dotted the wooded areas around Seattle's wealthy neighborhoods. The realization hardened something in him. They were looking for a payout, obviously. The mother had likely put the child up to this, using her as a sympathetic front for their scheme. He'd seen it before. The desperate would try anything for money. Richard stepped forward again, signaling to security. "I think we've had enough excitement for today. If you'll please escort the young lady back to her mother, we can bring this to a close." Marcus moved forward, reluctantly extending a hand to Zora. "Come on, kid, time to go." Zora looked from Marcus to Richard, then down at Atlas, who sensed the tension and pressed closer to her side. "But I did it," she said, her voice small but steady. "I calmed him, just like the challenge said." Richard avoided her gaze, addressing Marcus instead. "Today's event is over. Please clear the area." Diana, seeing security approach, her daughter pushed against the barrier. "Wait, what's going on? What challenge? What did she do?" A reporter quickly filled her in, explaining the $2 million offer and how Zora had succeeded where professionals had failed. Diana's expression transformed from confusion to shock, then to indignation. She turned blazing eyes on Richard. "My daughter met your challenge fair and square. Everyone here saw it." Patricia stepped between them, her smile tight and dismissive. "Ma'am, as I've explained, there were conditions to the challenge that were not met. No minor could qualify for the award." Diana's voice rose, drawing more attention. "That wasn't in anything you published. You're changing the rules because you don't want to pay." The crowd was growing restless, some calling out in support of Diana's accusation. Richard, unused to being challenged, felt his temper rising. "Security, please remove these people from my property. This event is concluded." Marcus hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sir, perhaps we should." That was an order, not a suggestion. Richard snapped loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. Atlas, responding to the sharp tone, stood up beside Zora, his posture alert but not aggressive. The dog's calm in the midst of rising tensions was a stark contrast to his previous behavior, further evidence of Zora's remarkable connection with him. 2 more security guards moved forward at Richard's command, entering the enclosure to escort Zora out, while others moved to contain Diana. What happened next was captured by dozens of cameras and would be replayed on social media millions of times in the coming days. As one guard reached for Zora's arm, Atlas positioned himself between them, not growling, but clearly protective. The guard hesitated, unwilling to risk, provoking the dog that had sent others to the hospital. "Atlas, come." Richard commanded, his voice harsh with frustration. For the first time in 3 years, Atlas ignored the command, remaining steadfastly beside Zora. The implicit rejection was like a slap to Richard's face. Diana, seeing her daughter seemingly threatened, attempted to climb over the barrier. "Don't you touch her," she shouted, as security tried to restrain her. The scene was devolving rapidly, the peaceful resolution of minutes ago replaced by chaos. Marcus made a split-second decision, moving to Diana's side rather than Zora's, helping her over the barrier rather than restraining her. "Mr. Blackwood," he said firmly, "this isn't right, and you know it." Richard's face darkened. "You're suspended effective immediately. Turn in your credentials on your way out." Marcus removed his security badge without hesitation, dropping it on the ground. "Gladly. Some things matter more than a paycheck." Diana reached Zora, pulling her daughter protectively against her side. Atlas surprisingly made no move to intervene, seeming to accept Diana's presence by extension of Zora's trust. "You promised $2 million to whoever could calm your dog," Diana said, addressing Richard directly, now her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed gathering. "My daughter did exactly that. Everyone here witnessed it." Richard's mask of composure had cracked, revealing glimpses of anger and something else, perhaps fear, underneath. "Get them off my property," he ordered the remaining security staff, turning away from the confrontation. The security team moved in, physically separating Zora from Atlas, despite the dog's agitated response to her distress. As mother and daughter were escorted toward the exit, Diana's voice rose once more. "You're a liar, Mr. Blackwood. A liar who hides behind his money and his lawyers because he has nothing else." Her words struck with precision, drawing blood in ways physical confrontation never could. The media captured everything: the successful challenge, the arbitrary disqualification, the forceful removal of mother and daughter, and most damaging of all, Atlas's visible distress as Zora was taken away. By evening, the footage was trending across all platforms, the narrative already solidifying against Richard. The wealthy recluse had offered a fortune, been beaten at his own game by a homeless child, then cruelly reneged on his promise. Commentators noted the racial dynamics at play, the stark contrast between the white billionaire and the black family he'd dismissed. Others pointed out the symbolism of Atlas's behavior, how the traumatized dog had recognized something in Zora that he responded to while rejecting the authority of his wealthy owner. Back in his mansion that night, Richard sat in his darkened study, a glass of scotch untouched beside him. Patricia had spent hours on damage control consultations with the legal team, drafting statements that might mitigate the PR disaster unfolding across social media. But Richard had stopped listening. His attention was fixed on Atlas, who lay in the corner of the room refusing food and water, his eyes constantly moving to the door as though expecting Zora to return. The dog's loyalty, once Richard's sole comfort, had been revealed as conditional, not a reflection of any special bond between them, but merely the dog's dependency on the only human who had been available. Given a choice, Atlas had chosen differently, and that knowledge cut deeper than Richard wanted to admit. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Richard confronted the possibility that his isolation had been self-imposed, a prison of his own making rather than a necessary retreat from a world that had taken his wife. And in that uncomfortable realization lurked an even more disturbing thought. What would Eleanor have thought of his behavior today? 3 days after the disastrous conclusion to Richard Blackwood's dog challenge, Carmen Rodriguez sat at her desk in the Seattle Tribune's downtown office, reviewing the footage for what felt like the 100th time. As an investigative journalist with 15 years of experience, Carmen had developed an instinct for stories that went deeper than their surface, and something about this one tugged at her professional curiosity. The video playing on her screen showed the moment when security removed Zora and her mother from Blackwood's estate, the German Shepherd visibly distressed at the girl's departure. Carmen paused the footage, studying Richard Blackwood's expression as he turned away from the confrontation. There was something there beyond anger or embarrassment, a flicker of recognition, perhaps as though Zora Johnson's words had struck a nerve. Carmen had been covering Seattle's housing crisis for the past 2 years, documenting the human cost of the tech boom that had transformed the city. The story of a homeless child succeeding where professionals failed only to be denied the promised reward fit perfectly into the larger narrative of inequality that defined modern Seattle. But Carmen sensed there was more to uncover here, connections not immediately apparent. She opened a new browser tab and began searching for information about Eleanor Blackwood Richard's late wife. Most articles focused on her death 3 years ago after a brief battle with an aggressive cancer, but Carmen dug deeper looking for details about Eleanor's life rather than her death. After an hour of research, a pattern began to emerge. Before her marriage to Richard, Eleanor Sullivan had been a dedicated advocate for homeless youth, establishing a foundation that provided educational opportunities and shelter for children living on Seattle's streets. Even after marrying into wealth, she had continued her work, though, with considerably more resources at her disposal. Carmen leaned back in her chair, processing this information. Richard Blackwood, who had just publicly humiliated a homeless child, had been married to a woman who dedicated her life to helping such children. The contradiction was striking. Picking up her phone, Carmen dialed a contact at City Hall who owed her a favor. After exchanging pleasantries, she asked about property developments in Seattle over the past decade, particularly those that had displaced low-income residents. An hour later, she was staring at a spreadsheet that connected the dots in ways she hadn't anticipated. Blackwood Technologies had a real estate subsidiary, Blackwood Properties, that had acquired and redeveloped numerous properties throughout Seattle, converting affordable housing into luxury apartments and high-end commercial spaces. One project in particular caught Carmen's attention, the Rainier Valley revitalization completed just 8 months ago. The timing aligned perfectly with what Zora Johnson had shouted during the confrontation. They had been homeless for 8 months. Could it be that Blackwood's own development had displaced the very family he had now publicly wronged? Carmen needed confirmation, and for that she needed to speak with someone from inside Blackwood's organization. She remembered Marcus, the security guard who had been suspended for supporting Diana and Zora. Finding him might not be easy, but Carmen had built her career on tracking down reluctant sources. A few calls to contacts in private security firms yielded results faster than expected. Marcus Williams had already found new employment with a competitor, his skills and experience, making him a valuable hire despite the circumstances of his departure from Blackwood's employ. Carmen arranged to meet him at a coffee shop, far from both Blackwood's estate and his new workplace. Marcus arrived precisely on time, his tall frame and alert eyes marking him as security even in civilian clothes. He regarded Carmen with cautious respect as they exchanged introductions. "I appreciate you meeting with me," Carmen said after they'd settled with their drinks. "I'm trying to understand what really happened at Blackwood's estate beyond what the cameras captured." Marcus considered her for a moment before responding. "What do you want to know? Tell me about Zora and her interaction with Atlas. In your professional opinion, was there anything unusual about how she approached the dog?" Marcus didn't hesitate. Everything about it was unusual. That dog sent trained professionals to the hospital, but with Zora, it was like he recognized something in her. "I've worked security for 15 years, handled K-9 units in the Army before that. I've never seen anything like it." Carmen nodded, making notes. "And Richard's reaction when she succeeded, did it surprise you?" Something flickered in Marcus's expression. "Not entirely, Mr. Blackwood. He's changed since his wife died. She was the heart of that household. After she was gone, he just shut down, shut everyone out. Atlas became his excuse to avoid the world." "His excuse?" Carmen prompted. Marcus leaned forward slightly. The dog's aggression was convenient. As long as Atlas couldn't be around people, Richard had a reason to isolate himself. When Zora connected with Atlas, she threatened that arrangement. The picture was becoming clearer, but Carmen needed more. "What can you tell me about Mrs. Blackwood?" Marcus's expression softened. "Eleanor was something special, treated everyone with the same respect from the gardener to the governor when he came to dinner. She was the one who rescued Atlas, actually. Found him at a shelter scheduled to be put down because of his fear aggression. She saw something in him worth saving." Carmen made another note. "And her charity work, was Richard involved?" Marcus shook his head. "Not really. He funded it because it mattered to her, but it wasn't his passion. After she died, the foundation continued, but it became just another tax write-off for him. The personal touch was gone." As their conversation continued, Carmen built a more complex portrait of Richard Blackwood, a man who had risen from modest beginnings through technological innovation, who had found in Eleanor a moral compass he himself lacked, and who had lost his way entirely after her death. The story was taking shape, but Carmen needed one more crucial piece. Do you know anything about the Rainier Valley Revitalization Project? It was completed about 8 months ago. Marcus frowned. Not much. I know it was controversial. A lot of families were displaced. There were protests, but they didn't get much media coverage. Would you be willing to introduce me to Zora and her mother? I'd like to hear their story directly. Marcus hesitated. They've been through enough already. How do I know your article won't just exploit them further? Carmen met his gaze directly. Because I'm not interested in a simple, poor homeless girl versus mean rich man narrative. I want to uncover the systemic issues that created this situation in the first place. And if Blackwood Properties is responsible for their homelessness, the public deserves to know that. After further discussion, Marcus agreed to reach out to Diana and Zora, promising nothing but offering to convey Carmen's interest in telling their full story. Meanwhile, Carmen continued her investigation into Blackwood Properties, discovering a pattern of development that consistently prioritized profit over community impact. The next morning, Carmen received a text from Marcus with an address for a coffee shop near the public library. She arrived to find Zora sitting alone at a corner table, a stack of books beside her. Diana, Marcus explained in a follow-up text, was at work, but had given permission for Carmen to speak with her daughter, provided she remained nearby watching from another table. Carmen approached, carefully introducing herself and explaining her interest in their story. Zora was reserved at first, but as Carmen asked about Atlas, rather than the confrontation with Richard, the girl became more animated. He wasn't mean, Zora explained, her eyes bright with conviction. He was scared. People think fear and aggression are opposites, but they're not. Fear causes aggression when there's no other option. How did you know how to approach him when the professionals couldn't figure it out? Carmen asked, genuinely curious. Zora shrugged slightly. I just listened. Everyone else came in with a plan to make him submit. I just wanted him to know he was safe with me. The simplicity and wisdom of the answer struck Carmen deeply. She continued asking questions, building rapport, until finally she felt comfortable bringing up the Rainier Valley development. Zora's expression changed immediately. That's where we lived before. Mom and I had an apartment there for 3 years. Then they sold the building, and the new owners tripled the rent. Mom got sick around the same time. Her arthritis got really bad. We couldn't afford the new rent, and nobody would rent to us without proof of income. That's how we ended up in the encampment. Carmen kept her voice neutral despite the confirmation of her suspicion. Do you know who bought the building? Zora shook her head. Some big company. Mom tried to fight it, went to meetings and stuff, but they said it was legal. By the time Diana joined them after her shift ended, Carmen had gathered enough information to confirm her theory. The company that had purchased and redeveloped the building where Diana and Zora had lived was indeed Blackwood Properties, operating through a subsidiary to avoid direct association with the Blackwood name. The irony was both perfect and tragic. Richard Blackwood had indirectly caused the homelessness of the very child who had broken through his dog's defenses and potentially his own emotional walls. Back at her office, Carmen worked late into the night crafting an article that went beyond the viral video to examine the interconnected issues at Playtech Wealth transforming Seattle, the housing crisis, displacing families, the broken systems that failed to protect vulnerable citizens like Diana and Zora. She titled it, The Price of Progress, How a Billionaire's Challenge Revealed Seattle's Broken Promise. As she worked, Carmen received an unexpected email from a former employee of Eleanor Blackwood's foundation responding to an inquiry she had sent earlier. Attached was a photo that made Carmen catch her breath. Eleanor kneeling beside a newly rescued Atlas, the dog's fearful posture remarkably similar to how he had appeared in the viral video before Zora calmed him. The resemblance between Eleanor's approach to the traumatized animal and Zora's was uncanny. Both showed the same patience, the same respect for the dog's fear, rather than attempting to dominate it. Carmen added this detail to her article, the final piece that transformed it from a simple exposé into something more nuanced, a story about lost connection and the possibility of redemption. Have you ever wondered why some people can connect with animals when others can't? Comment number 1. If you believe Zora's ability to calm Atlas was just a natural gift. Comment number 2. If you think it came from her own experiences of fear and understanding what it means to feel vulnerable. Like this video if you've ever had a special connection with an animal that others couldn't understand, and subscribe to see how this incredible story of courage and compassion continues to unfold. Do you think Richard will ever recognize the truth about his own role in Zora and Diana's homelessness? What responsibility do wealthy developers have to the communities they transform? And most importantly, will Atlas ever be reunited with the only person besides his original rescuer who truly understood him? The morning Carmen Rodriguez's article hit the front page of the Seattle Tribune, Richard Blackwood sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the newspaper as though it were a venomous snake. The headline glared back at him, "The Price of Progress: How a Billionaire's Challenge Revealed Seattle's Broken Promise." Beneath it, a split image showed Atlas with Zora on one side and a photograph of Eleanor kneeling beside the same dog years earlier. On the other, their postures nearly identical. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he forced himself to read the entire piece, each paragraph more damning than the last. Carmen had meticulously connected every dot, how his company's development had directly displaced Zora and her mother, how Eleanor's foundation for homeless youth had been neglected after her death, how the dog that had responded to Zora had originally been rescued by Eleanor, using the same gentle approach. Most devastating was the final revelation, that the Rainier Valley building where Diana and Zora had lived had been purchased through a subsidiary, specifically to avoid public connection to the Blackwood name, a tactic Eleanor had apparently fought against before her illness. The article quoted former foundation employees, describing heated arguments between the couple over Richard's business practices. The portrait painted was crystal clear. Eleanor had been the conscience Richard now lacked. His phone began ringing incessantly as the article spread online. Patricia called 7 times before he finally answered, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The board is convening an emergency meeting this afternoon. They're talking about a vote of no confidence, Richard. This is catastrophic for the company image." Richard barely registered her words, his attention fixed on Atlas, who lay listlessly in the corner of the kitchen, his food bowl untouched for the 3rd consecutive day. The veterinarian had visited yesterday, finding nothing physically wrong, but warning that the dog's depression could become life-threatening if it continued. "Are you even listening?" Patricia demanded. "We need to craft a response immediately. Issue a statement about the girl's trespassing, the liability issues, anything to shift the narrative." Richard ended the call without responding, his eyes still on Atlas. The dog who had been his sole companion for 3 years was slipping away, pining for the child who had broken through his defenses. Outside the gates of his estate, the first protesters appeared mid-morning, their signs visible through the security cameras, "Pay what you owe, homes, not profit, justice for Zora." By noon, their numbers had swelled to over 100, the demonstration covered by local news vans that had stationed themselves permanently across the street since the viral video first broke. Richard's security team, short-staffed after Marcus's departure inspired others to resign, reported that several protesters were former residents displaced by Blackwood Properties developments. Carmen's article had given them names and faces to attach to the systemic issues they'd been fighting. Richard's lawyer arrived at one grim-faced as he was escorted past the protesters. "We need to settle this immediately," he advised, spreading documents across Richard's desk. "Offer the $2 million as a goodwill gesture, plus an additional sum for emotional distress. We'll need NDAs, of course." When Richard didn't immediately respond, the lawyer continued more forcefully. "This isn't just about the girl anymore. Carmen Rodriguez has opened a Pandora's box. We're already receiving inquiries about class action suits from other displaced residents. Your board is in panic mode. You need to contain this now." Richard finally spoke, his voice hollow. What would Eleanor think of all this? The question seemed to catch the lawyer off guard. After an uncomfortable pause, he replied carefully. "Eleanor was an idealist, Richard. Business requires pragmatism. Does it require deception? Using shell companies to hide our involvement in developments we knew would displace families. The lawyer's expression hardened. Those were your directives, Richard. The legal team simply implemented them. The truth of that statement hit Richard with physical force. He had given those orders, created those policies, all while telling himself they were necessary for progress, for innovation, for growth. Eleanor had challenged him on it. Yes, but after each argument, he had continued on his chosen path, secure in his conviction that the end justified the means. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. The board meeting was beginning. They were video conferencing him and expecting him to defend himself, to fight for his position. Richard stared at the message without responding. In the corner, Atlas whined softly, the first sound he'd made all day. Richard looked up to find the dog standing at the window, staring out toward the gates where the protesters continued their demonstration. Following the dog's gaze, Richard was struck by a sudden realization. Atlas wanted to leave as much as he did. After dismissing the lawyer with vague assurances of action, Richard sat alone in his study. Carmen's article spread before him. He found himself returning to a particular passage about Zora's approach to Atlas. She didn't try to dominate or control him, Marcus Williams had explained. She just created a space where he felt safe enough to choose trust over fear. The words echoed in Richard's mind, taking on significance beyond their immediate context. What would it mean to choose trust over fear in his own life? Eleanor had tried to show him, but he hadn't been ready to see. The thought of his late wife brought a familiar ache, but with it came a new question. What would she want him to do now? As evening approached, Richard made a decision. Ignoring the continuing calls from his board and PR team, he changed into his simplest clothes, jeans and a sweater he hadn't worn in years, and called for his car. His security detail was alarmed at his intention to leave the estate with protesters still at the gates, but Richard was insistent. Use the service entrance, he instructed, and no escort. I need to do this alone. Atlas, sensing the unusual activity, followed Richard with more energy than he'd shown in days. On impulse, Richard attached the dog's rarely used leash to his collar. "Want to come along, boy?" The dog's tail gave a single, uncertain wag. 20 minutes later, Richard's driver dropped them at Seattle General Hospital. Confusion evident in his expression, but questions unasked. Richard had learned from Carmen's article that Zora Johnson had been admitted 2 days ago with pneumonia likely exacerbated by the harsh living conditions in the encampment. Finding her room wasn't difficult. The nurse at the reception desk recognized Richard immediately, her eyes widening in surprise at his request. Outside Diana's room, Richard hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What right did he have to intrude on this family? He had wronged so deeply. Before he could decide whether to proceed or retreat, the door opened, and Zora stepped into the hallway. She froze at the sight of Richard, her expression guarded, then noticed Atlas beside him. The change was immediate, her face softening with concern as she knelt to the dog's level. "He's not eating," Richard said the words, emerging before he could consider them. "The vet says there's nothing physically wrong, but—" Atlas strained toward Zora, whining softly. The girl reached out, allowing the dog to sniff her hand, before gently stroking his head. "He's sad," she said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He doesn't understand why I left." The interaction drew the attention of a nurse, who immediately objected to the dog's presence. Richard found himself using his name and influence for perhaps the first meaningful purpose in years, securing special permission for Atlas's visit as a therapeutic intervention. The hospital administrator was summoned. Exceptions were made, paperwork signed. Throughout the bureaucratic flurry, Richard remained acutely aware of Zora's cautious observation. She hadn't asked why he was there, or what he wanted. She simply weighted her focus primarily on Atlas's evident joy at their reunion. When they were finally allowed to enter Diana's room, Richard's confidence faltered again. Zora Johnson lay in the hospital bed, an IV in her arm, and monitors tracking her vital signs. Her eyes narrowed with recognition as Richard entered behind Zora and Atlas. "What is he doing here?" she asked, her voice weak, but the anger unmistakable. Richard had prepared no speech, no carefully crafted apology. Standing in that sterile hospital room facing the woman, his actions had helped to make homeless words seemed woefully inadequate. "I read the article," he said finally, "about the Rainier Valley development. I didn't know it was your building, but that's no excuse. I should have known about all of them." Diana's expression remained unyielding. "You came all this way to tell me you're sorry. Save it for your press conference." Richard shook his head. "No press conference. No cameras. Just—" He glanced down at Atlas, who had settled contentedly beside Zora. "I needed to see if he would get better. And I needed to see what you needed." Diana's laugh held no humor. "What I need my health back. I need a home for my daughter. I need the last 8 months of our lives back. Can your billions provide any of that, Mr. Blackwood?" The challenge in her question was clear, but so was the fundamental truth behind it. Money could not undo, the past could not heal all wounds. But perhaps it could offer a different future. "The money for the challenge is yours," Richard said. "The full 2 million, no conditions, no publicity requirements. My lawyer will bring the paperwork tomorrow. But that's just the beginning of what I owe you, what I owe a lot of people." For the first time since he'd entered, Diana's expression showed something other than anger. Skepticism, perhaps, but also a flicker of cautious interest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to make amends. Not just to you and Zora, but to everyone displaced by my developments. I have the resources to do it, and thanks to your daughter I might finally have the perspective I've been missing." The conversation that followed was difficult, raw with honesty on both sides. Diana's justifiable anger and skepticism met Richard's halting attempts to articulate a transformation he himself barely understood. By the time visiting hours ended, no magical reconciliation had occurred, but perhaps a foundation for something authentic had been laid. As Richard and Atlas prepared to leave, Zora walked them to the elevator. Looking down at her, Richard was struck by her composure, her dignity despite everything she had endured. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "My wife." She could see beyond defenses, too. Zora considered this, then asked the question. No adult in Richard's life had dared to pose directly. "Why did you break your promise about the money?" Richard found himself answering, with uncharacteristic honesty. "Because you scared me. Not you specifically, but what you represented. If Atlas could connect with you, after 3 years of connecting with no one but me, what did that say about my isolation? Was it necessary or just easier than facing a world without Eleanor?" The elevator arrived, but Richard made no move to enter it. "I've been hiding," he continued more to himself than to Zora, "using Atlas's aggression as an excuse, using my grief as a shield. Seeing you break through to him meant I had no more excuses." Zora studied him thoughtfully. Atlas was hiding too, behind his growls and his teeth, but he was just waiting for someone to show him it was safe to come out. As Richard finally stepped into the elevator, Atlas beside him, he carried with him the simple wisdom of Zora's words. The question now was whether he, like his dog, could find the courage to emerge from behind his own defensive barriers and face the world he'd been avoiding for 3 years. The morning after his visit to the hospital, Richard Blackwood sat in his car outside the woodland area where Diana and Zora had been living. Atlas sat in the back seat more alert than he had been in days, his ears perked forward with interest at the unfamiliar surroundings. Richard had come alone, having given his driver the day off, needing the privacy to process what he was about to witness. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, feeling immediately out of place in his casual clothes, that despite being his least expensive, still marked him as an outsider. Atlas followed, staying close to his side as they approached the encampment. Richard had learned its location from Marcus, who had agreed to meet him there only after a lengthy phone conversation in which Richard had tried to explain his intentions. The former security guard was waiting at the edge of the clearing, his expression guarded as Richard approached. "They know you're coming," Marcus said by way of greeting. "Some weren't happy about it. These people have had enough cameras and gawkers since the story broke." Richard nodded, understanding the implication. "I'm not here as a tourist or for a photo op. I need to see it for myself." Marcus studied him for a moment, then gestured for Richard to follow. The encampment was both smaller and more organized than Richard had expected. about 20 structures ranging from proper tents to improvised shelters made of tarps, and found materials were arranged in a rough circle. A communal fire pit sat in the center, currently cold in the morning light. What struck Richard immediately was the evident effort to create normalcy clotheslines with freshly washed items, small container gardens with herbs and vegetables paths swept clear of debris. Marcus led him to a blue tarp stretched over a frame of branches larger than some of the other shelters, but still heartbreakingly inadequate. "This is where Diana and Zora live," he explained, pulling back the entrance flap. Richard hesitated before ducking inside, feeling like an intruder. The interior was meticulously organized despite its limitations. Plastic bins contained neatly folded clothes. A shelf made from salvaged boards held books, many about animals and nature. A thin foam mattress covered with a clean blanket served as their bed. Small touches of personality were evident everywhere. A child's drawings pinned to the tarp walls, a vase of wildflowers on an upturned crate that served as a table, a stuffed elephant worn thin with love. Richard stood silently absorbing the details of this home that was nothing like his sprawling mansion, yet contained something his own house lacked: a palpable sense of care, of effort, of dignity, maintained against impossible odds. Atlas moved past Richard, sniffing at the bedding, and the elephant recognizing Zora's scent. 8 months, Richard said quietly. "They've lived like this for 8 months, while I rattled around in 40,000 square feet of emptiness." Marcus made no response, allowing the reality to speak for itself. Outside again, Richard met some of the encampment residents, each with their own story of how they had ended up there. A former teacher whose medical bills after a car accident had depleted his savings. A young couple, both working minimum-wage jobs that couldn't cover Seattle's soaring rents. An elderly woman whose fixed income hadn't kept pace with the cost of living. Several mentioned developments that had displaced them from affordable housing. Not all Blackwood properties, but enough that Richard felt the weight of his industry's collective impact. As they walked back toward his car, Richard asked the question that had been forming since reading Carmen's article. The foundation Eleanor started for homeless youth. What happened to it after she died? Marcus's expression softened slightly at the mention of Eleanor. "It's still operating technically. Has an office downtown, staff, regular fundraisers. But the heart went out of it. Became more about maintaining the Blackwood name than actually helping people." Richard absorbed this information silently. By the time they reached his car, his mind was made up. "I need your help, Marcus. Not as an employee, but as someone who sees what I've been blind to." Marcus raised an eyebrow, skeptical but listening. "What kind of help?" "I want to rebuild Eleanor's foundation, but with actual impact this time. Not just throwing money at the problem while continuing to cause it with my other hand. I need someone who understands both sides, who knows business but hasn't lost touch with the people we're supposed to be helping." The conversation continued for over an hour, Richard outlining a vision that had begun forming since his confrontation with Zora and Diana, Marcus challenging assumptions and adding perspectives Richard would never have considered. By the time they parted, a tentative alliance had formed conditional on Richard, demonstrating through actions, not just words, that his transformation was genuine. That afternoon, Richard returned to the hospital, this time bringing not just Atlas, but a proposal for Diana. The dog's joy at seeing Zora again was evident, his entire body wiggling with excitement as he covered her face with gentle licks. Diana, sitting up in bed and looking marginally better than the previous day, watched the reunion with a mix of emotions. "The doctors say I can leave tomorrow," she informed Richard, her tone neutral. "Back to the woods, I suppose." Richard shook his head, placing a folder on her bed tray. "Not if you don't want to. This is a lease agreement for an apartment in Fremont. 2 bedrooms, ground floor, because of your arthritis, month to month, so you're not locked in. First year's rent prepaid." Diana didn't touch the folder. "And what do you want in exchange?" "Our silence, our gratitude." Neither Richard replied honestly. "This isn't charity or a bribe, it's restitution. The beginning of it anyway." He hesitated, then continued. "There's something else I'd like to discuss, but it's not a condition of the apartment. That's yours, regardless." Diana's wariness didn't fade, but she nodded for him to continue. Richard explained his plans to restructure Eleanor's foundation, to shift its focus from symbolic gestures to substantial change. "I need someone to run it," he concluded. "Someone who understands firsthand what it means to fall through the cracks of our system. Someone with both the lived experience and the administrative skills. Marcus mentioned you worked in office administration before your health declined." Diana's expression registered surprise, then suspicion. "You want me to be your token hire, the formerly homeless black woman who gives your rebranding authenticity?" Richard had expected this response and didn't bristle at it. "I want you to have actual authority, not just a title. The foundation would have independent governance, its own board, separate from Blackwood Technologies. You'd answer to that board, not to me. And yes, your perspective is exactly what the foundation needs, but not as a token, as a corrective to the blindness that's defined it for too long." The conversation that followed was challenging, with Diana pushing back on every point, testing for weaknesses or hidden agendas in Richard's proposal. She made no commitments, agreeing only to consider the offer once she was released from the hospital and had time to review the details with a lawyer of her choosing at Richard's expense. Throughout their discussion, Richard noticed Zora sitting quietly with Atlas, the two seemingly engaged in their own silent communication. When a nurse arrived to check Diana's vitals, Richard took the opportunity to speak with Zora alone in the hallway. "How did you know what to do with him?" he asked, nodding toward Atlas, who had followed Zora as naturally as if they'd been companions for years. "How did you know he would respond to you?" Zora considered the question seriously. "I didn't know for sure, but I noticed something in the videos of the other trainers. They all came in trying to be the boss to make Atlas obey, but that's not what he needed." "What did he need?" Zora looked up at Richard, her expression far older than her 11 years. "The same thing everybody needs. To be seen as more than just what you can get from them. Dogs know the difference between someone who sees them as a thing to control and someone who sees them as a being with their own feelings." The simplicity and wisdom of her answer struck Richard deeply. How many people in his life had he viewed as means to an end, rather than as complete beings with their own inherent value? How many decisions had he made based solely on what he could extract from a situation, rather than what he could contribute to it? Later that day, as promised, Richard's lawyer arrived with paperwork for the full $2 million payment, no strings attached. Diana reviewed each page carefully, asking pointed questions that revealed her intelligence and attention to detail, despite her lack of legal training. When she finally signed, there was no celebration, no handshakes or photographs. Just a quiet acknowledgement that this was indeed only the beginning of a much longer process. As Richard prepared to leave, Zora approached him with a request that caught him off guard. "Could Atlas stay with me tonight? Just for one night. He gets sad when we're apart." Richard's instinctive response was refusal. Atlas had been his sole companion for 3 years, the one living connection to Eleanor he still maintained. The thought of being in his empty house without even the dog's presence was daunting. But looking at Atlas, clearly content at Zora's side, Richard recognized the selfishness of his impulse. Of course, he found himself saying, he'd like that. That night, alone in his mansion for the first time in years, Richard wandered from room to room, seeing the space with new eyes. The excessive luxury, the emptiness, the sterility of it all struck him forcefully. Eleanor had tried to make it a home, filling it with warmth and life during their years together. After her death, he had preserved it like a mausoleum, changing nothing but allowing the soul she had infused to gradually fade. In his study, Richard found himself staring at the wall of photographs he had avoided looking at for 3 years. Eleanor smiled back at him from dozens of frames. Eleanor at the foundation's opening, surrounded by the young people she had dedicated herself to helping. Eleanor in the garden she had planted herself despite the landscaper's protests. Eleanor, kneeling beside Atlas the day they had brought him home, her expression radiating the patient compassion Zora had shown in that viral video. "I've made a mess of things, haven't I?" Richard said aloud to the photographs. "Hiding away, using grief as an excuse not to live up to what you believed in, what you believed I could be." No answer came, of course, but in the silence of the house, Richard felt something shift within him. The grief was still there, would always be there, but perhaps it didn't have to be a wall separating him from the world. Perhaps it could be a bridge connecting him to what had mattered most to Eleanor and what might yet matter to him again. The following week brought rapid changes. Diana and Zora moved into the apartment in Fremont, bringing with them Rusty, the pit bull mix from the encampment who had been Zora's first rehabilitation project. Atlas split his time between Richard's estate and the apartment, gradually adjusting to having two homes. Richard, with Marcus's guidance, began the process of restructuring Eleanor's foundation, drafting a new mission statement that explicitly addressed the housing crisis his own company had helped create. The board of Blackwood Technologies, initially in panic mode over the PR disaster, found themselves confronted with a CEO they barely recognized, one who spoke of responsibility, restitution, and radical change to their business model. Not all were pleased with this transformation, particularly when Richard proposed converting some of their luxury developments back to affordable housing at a significant financial loss. Resistance was strong, with several board members threatening to force him out if he persisted. Richard faced them calmly in the boardroom where he had once dominated through intimidation and force of will. "I understand your concerns," he acknowledged. "They were my concerns too not long ago. But I've been given an opportunity to see beyond the balance sheet to the human impact of our decisions. I'm not asking you to abandon profit as a motive, but to expand your definition of value to include the communities we affect." The battle was far from over, but Richard found unexpected allies, both within the company and beyond it. Carmen Rodriguez's follow-up articles documented his efforts honestly, neither whitewashing his past actions nor dismissing his attempts at change. Public opinion began to shift, not to universal approval but to a cautious recognition that something genuine might be occurring. Throughout these tumultuous weeks, it was Zora who provided Richard with the clearest perspective. During his visits to the apartment, ostensibly to see Atlas, he found himself increasingly drawn to conversations with the young girl, whose wisdom belied her years. "Why do you think money makes you more important than other people?" she asked him, once the directness of the question cutting through his defenses. I don't think that he had protested automatically. Zora just looked at him waiting. After a moment, Richard amended his response. "I didn't think I thought that. But my actions showed otherwise, didn't they?" Zora nodded, satisfied with his honesty. "That's the first step," she said. "Seeing the gap between what you say and what you do." It was in these conversations, more than in the corporate boardrooms or foundation meetings, that Richard's true transformation took root. Through Zora's uncompromising perspective, he began to recognize the protective walls he had built, not just after Eleanor's death, but long before, walls of privilege, of wealth, of power, that had separated him from the consequences of his decisions and the humanity of those affected by them. And as those walls slowly began to crumble, Richard found himself facing a choice: retreat back into the familiar isolation of wealth and power, or step forward into the uncertain, challenging, but ultimately more authentic connection that Zora, Diana, and even Atlas were offering him. 6 months after the viral video that had changed everything, Richard Blackwood stood on a podium in the Seattle Community Center, the cameras he had once courted for his dog challenge, now recording a very different kind of event. Beside him stood Zora Johnson, looking remarkably transformed from the exhausted, ill woman he had first met in the hospital. Today, she wore a tailored suit, her hair styled elegantly, her posture conveying a quiet confidence as she addressed the gathered media and community members. "The Eleanor Blackwood Foundation for Community Housing is not just another charity," Diana explained, her voice strong and clear. "Our mission goes beyond providing temporary shelter or occasional support. We aim to create sustainable solutions to homelessness by addressing its root causes: unaffordable housing, inadequate health care, and the systematic inequalities that push people to the margins." Richard watched her speak with profound respect. In just 6 months, Diana had proven herself not just capable, but exceptional as the Foundation's executive director. Her first-hand experience with homelessness, combined with her administrative skills and unflinching honesty, had transformed the organization from a well-meaning but ineffective charity into a powerful advocate for genuine change. Behind them stood a large check, not the $2 million of the original challenge, but $20 million Richard's personal contribution to launch the Foundation's new initiative. The funds would be used to purchase and convert one of Blackwood Properties' luxury developments back into affordable housing, with priority given to families displaced by previous development projects. It was a significant financial loss for Richard personally, but one he now recognized as an investment in something far more valuable than profit margins. As Diana concluded her remarks, Richard stepped forward to make the formal presentation. The applause was polite rather than enthusiastic. He had not been fully forgiven by the community, nor did he expect or want to be. This wasn't about redemption or rehabilitating his image. It was about taking concrete action to address the harm he had helped to cause. Among the crowd, Richard spotted Zora, sitting with Atlas and Rusty, both dogs now certified as therapy animals, who regularly visited homeless shelters and community centers. At 12 years old, Zora had become the Foundation's youth ambassador, speaking at schools about homelessness and working with other children to break down stereotypes and build empathy. Atlas, once so aggressive he couldn't be around. Strangers now wore a therapy dog vest and calmly accepted pets from children and adults alike. His transformation mirrored Richard's own journey from isolation to engagement. After the formal ceremony, as the crowd mingled during the reception, Richard found himself approached by Carmen Rodriguez, the journalist whose investigative reporting had set everything in motion. Quite a change from the dog challenge, she observed, notepad in hand. Is this all just an elaborate PR strategy, Mr. Blackwood, or has something fundamentally shifted in your perspective? Richard considered the question seriously, respecting Carmen's continued skepticism. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't lived it, he admitted. 6 months ago, I was using my dog's aggression as an excuse to isolate myself from a world I didn't want to face after my wife's death. I was using my wealth to build walls between myself and the consequences of my actions. He glanced toward where Zora sat with the dog's children from the community, cautiously approaching to pet them under her guidance. It took a child with nothing to show me how empty my life had become, despite having everything. That's not PR. That's a wake-up call I couldn't ignore once I heard it. Carmen made notes, her expression neutral but not dismissive. Your board wasn't entirely supportive of these changes. 3 members resigned in protest of your new direction. Richard nodded. Change is uncomfortable, especially when it affects the bottom line. But we're finding that ethical business practices don't have to mean financial failure. Different, yes. More modest growth, certainly. But also more sustainable both for the company and the community we operate in. As the conversation continued, Marcus approached now, officially, the Foundation's security director, but functioning more as Richard's bridge to communities he had previously ignored. With Marcus came updates about the renovation project, progress reports on families being rehoused, and questions requiring Richard's input. No longer isolated in his mansion, Richard now moved between worlds. The corporate boardroom, where he continued to push for ethical business practices, the Foundation offices, where Diana led with clarity and purpose, and the community. Centers and shelters, where he witnessed firsthand the impact of both the problems he had helped create and the solutions he was now supporting. Later that evening, Richard joined Diana and Zora for dinner at their apartment, a monthly ritual that had begun awkwardly but gradually evolved into something approaching friendship. Atlas and Rusty greeted him enthusiastically at the door, the German shepherd now comfortable dividing his loyalty between Richard and Zora without the anxiety that had once plagued him. Over Diana's home-cooked meal, they discussed the day's events and plans for the Foundation's future. The board approved the expansion to Tacoma. Diana reported, her tone professional, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. We can start identifying properties next month. And Principal Washington said, I can start the education program at school when the new semester begins. Zora added, her enthusiasm evident. Teaching kids about homelessness from a kid who actually experienced it. Richard listened to their plans with genuine interest, occasionally offering resources or connections, but never attempting to control the direction. He had learned to value their perspectives, to recognize that his wealth and influence were tools to support their vision rather than impose his own. As the evening wound down, Richard found himself on the small balcony with Diana watching the lights of Seattle, while Zora prepared the dog's evening routine inside. "I never thanked you properly," Richard said quietly. Diana raised an eyebrow. "For what, taking the job? Accepting the apartment, the money?" "For not making it easy," Richard clarified. "You could have taken the check and disappeared. Instead, you challenged me to do better, to be better. You didn't let me buy my way out of responsibility." Diana considered this, then nodded slowly. "My mother always said comfort is the enemy of growth. If I'd made it comfortable for you, nothing would have really changed." Inside, they could hear Zora laughing as the dogs performed tricks they had taught them, the sound of joy unmarred by the hardships she had endured. "She's an extraordinary child," Richard observed. "She gets that from you." Diana smiled, a rare, unguarded moment between them. "She is, but what she did with Atlas, with you, that's all Zora. She sees past defenses to what's underneath. Always has." As Richard prepared to leave, Zora approached with a request. "We're visiting the Woodland Park shelter tomorrow with the dogs. Would you want to come? Some of the kids there are really interested in technology. They might like meeting a real inventor." The invitation, casually offered but significant in its implication, touched Richard deeply. 6 months ago, he had been a recluse, using grief as a shield against connection. Now he was being invited to share his knowledge with children who might benefit from it, to be part of something meaningful beyond his wealth. "I'd like that very much," he replied, meaning it completely. The foundation ceremony that morning had been public photographed and reported on by media across the city. But this, Richard reflected as he drove home with Atlas sleeping contentedly in the back seat, was where real change happened, not in grand gestures before cameras, but in small moments of connection, of sharing, of breaking down the barriers between people that wealth and poverty, race and privilege so often created. At home, Richard walked through rooms that had once felt like a mausoleum to his grief. Gradually, life had returned to the space. Eleanor's photographs were no longer shrines to be avoided, but reminders of the values she had embodied, values he was now striving to honor in action rather than just memory. In his study, a new photograph had joined the collection, Zora sitting cross-legged on the grass during the dog challenge, Atlas's head in her lap, the moment when everything had changed. Beside it stood a framed copy of the check for $2 million. A reminder not of his generosity, but of how close he had come to betraying his own humanity for the sake of pride and fear. As Atlas settled in his bed, Richard sat down at his desk to review plans for the next foundation project. The work was ongoing, the transformation incomplete. There were still board members to convince, policies to change, structures to dismantle and rebuild. But for the first time in years, Richard felt aligned with something larger than himself, connected to a purpose that Eleanor would have recognized and supported. The wealth that had once isolated him was now a tool for healing the very communities his business practices had harmed. It wasn't redemption. He understood now that some harms could never be fully undone. But it was a path forward, a way to honor both the pain of the past and the possibility of the future. Outside the Seattle, rain began to fall, gentle and cleansing. Richard thought of Diana and Zora in their apartment, no longer exposed to the elements, no longer invisible to the society that had once failed them. He thought of the other families who would soon have homes through the Foundation's work, and of the many more still waiting, still struggling. The task was enormous, the injustices deep-rooted and complex. But as Eleanor had often said, and as Zora had shown him through her courage and compassion, the only way forward was one step at a time, one connection at a time, one barrier broken down at a time. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or property or power, but in the courage to face one's own failings, and the commitment to do better, to be better, not just for oneself, but for the community to which all humans, regardless of circumstance, ultimately belonged. Has this story touched your heart? Comment below with the moment that moved you most. Was it when Zora first calmed Atlas, when Richard recognized his role in Diana and Zora's homelessness, or when the new foundation was established? Like this video if you believe in the power of second chances, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about courage, compassion, and overcoming prejudice. Would you have forgiven Richard if you were in Diana and Zora's position? Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the most unlikely connections can transform lives. Thank you for watching, and remember that true wealth isn't measured by what we have, but by how we use it to lift others up. This story reminds us that prejudice often operates invisibly in our daily choices and systems we create. Richard's journey shows how wealth and privilege can blind us to the consequences of our actions on others, particularly those from different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. Zora's ability to connect with Atlas demonstrates how children often see beyond the barriers adults construct around themselves and others. True transformation requires acknowledging our biases and taking responsibility for the harm we've caused, even when unintentional. The systemic racism and inequality embedded in housing and economic development can't be solved with charity alone. It demands structural change and listening to those most affected. Diana's insistence on dignity rather than gratitude highlights how true justice differs from performative generosity. Atlas's behavior teaches us that fear often masks itself as aggression, and patience can reveal the vulnerability underneath. Perhaps most importantly, this story shows that redemption isn't found in grand gestures, but in consistent actions that align with our values. Wealth isn't measured by possessions, but by our capacity to use our resources, whatever they may be, to uplift those society has marginalized and forgotten. What moment in this story resonated most deeply with you? Did you see yourself in Richard's blindness to privilege, Zora's compassionate insight, or Diana's dignified resilience? Comment below with your thoughts on how we can each work to recognize and address racial discrimination in our own communities. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to see more content that explores the complex realities of race, class, and human connection in America. Share with someone who needs a reminder that transformation is always possible when we're willing to truly see each other. Thank you for watching. And remember that the journey toward justice begins with honest self-reflection and the courage to change.